Still, down. Come on, guys, down in front, please.
Okay, we'll be here for a few minutes. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us here today. My name is Brooke Salkoff. I'm here with SALDEF, which is the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund out of Washington, D.C. And the Sikh Coalition, New York-based Sikh Coalition, is also here hosting this event. We'd like to, first of all, thank Columbia University. Columbia University's SEVA group, the student group that has been so helpful in reacting and supporting and facilitating this event for us today. Also the School of International and Public Affairs and the Earth Institute. We'd like to thank Jesse and Steve Cohen of the Earth Institute for helping to facilitate this event on such really short notice. So as I mentioned, the event today, this news conference, is hosted by two Sikh advocacy organizations who are working in partnership, SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Sikh Coalition based here in New York City. Coincidentally, there are two very timely research reports out of each organization that shows that what has happened to Dr. Prabhjot Singh on Saturday night is not an isolated incident, it's not an isolated act, unfortunately. So here's how things are going to work today. I'm here really to facilitate and make sure that you all get what you need in terms of information and sound and pictures. But we realize that everybody is on deadline, and we're going to try to keep it as tight as we can. So you'll only hear from three people today. Executive Director Jasjit Singh, who's on your right here. Also, Amardeep Singh, who is the Program Director for the Sikh Coalition. And Dr. Prabhjot Singh will speak after that. But each of them will take 3 to 5 minutes to talk about the latest research, and then we'll open it up to questions, and I'll be back.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you, members of the press, members of our community who are here. My name is Jasjit Singh. I'll spell it for you, Jasjit. Last name Singh, S-I-N-G-H. You should just keep that last name handy today. And I'm the Executive Director of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, SALDEF. So thank you all for being here with us today. It's obviously on an unfortunate circumstance that we're all meeting here today, but it's also out of, I believe, concern for our community as New Yorkers and as Americans. We have with us, of course, Prabhjot Singh, who's going to share his experience, but what I'd like to share with you today from the perspective of our national advocacy group is that unfortunately, the sort of assault that Prabhjot Singh has faced is not something that we are terribly unfamiliar with. In the years after 9/11, our community has been, unfortunately, disproportionately targeted, whether it comes from challenges related to hate crimes, racial profiling, school bullying, or employment discrimination. This community is no stranger to these types of incidents. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we released some research results in collaboration with Stanford University, a report called Turban Myths, where we started to unwrap exactly how big the challenge of misunderstandings and misconceptions are as they relate to Sikh Americans. Now, we are the world's 5th largest religion. There are about 500,000 Sikhs in this country. Our beliefs are around truth, justice, service, compassion, and in remembrance of one God. I think many of these are universal ideals shared not only by most Americans, but most humans. Now, at the same time, although we know that this is what our faith stands for, we learned through this research that, in fact, our articles of faith, in particular the turban and beard oftentimes, is causing quite a bit of confusion. It's, in fact, one of the big takeaways from the research was that the number one figure that's associated with the turban and beard amongst the average American is that of Osama bin Laden. Think of that for a moment. The face of violence and extremism, terrorism over the last couple decades is the face of our faith, which at its core, and as I said, is built upon compassion, loyalty, truth, and justice. So if you'd like any additional information, I can share that after this press conference about the turban myths research that was done with Stanford University. The other high level was that 70% of people do not know who a Sikh American is. They don't know where we originate from, what we believe, and of course, what we stand for. So we're working to resolve that issue in partnership with our friends at the Sikh Coalition, and so I'll pass it over to Amardeep to share further. Thank you again.
Good afternoon. Let me first just express my condolences, though I already have personally, but publicly, to Dr. Singh for what he endured, and really thank him for his courage for being here today. It's really rare that we see in our community that people feel comfortable standing up and speaking out as to their experience. Dr. Singh is going to speak soon, and he's somebody that people need to hear to have a better understanding of what's happening here in this great city, New York City, and around the country. My name is Amardeep Singh. That's spelled A-M-A-R-D-E-E-P. I'll be really disappointed if you can't spell the word Singh at this point, but it's S-I-N-G-H. We know that 3 times is a charm, so you'll get it when Prabhjot Singh says his name. The Sikh Coalition is a New York City-based organization. We were formed the day after 9/11, 12 years ago, to combat bias and discrimination against the Sikh community, and to make our community more reflective of the E pluribus unum values that we purport to represent. And so I would say this, that what happened 2 days ago to Dr. Singh did not happen in a vacuum. Now, it's 12 years after 9/11, and yet I still find myself having to explain that I was born and raised in this country. I played Little League Baseball. My mother was a soccer mom. I'm a diehard New York Yankees fan. I'm an American. Those conversations still have to happen. And so when I say this did not happen in a vacuum, consider this. In the last year, a Sikh motorist driving with his 13-year-old son was shot in a drive-by shooting in a random act of hate of what police locally in Sarasota, California, Florida, called a hate crime. In Fresno, California, in the past year, an 81-year-old Sikh gentleman was beaten with steel pipes outside a Sikh house of worship in Fresno. In Washington, Seattle, Washington, in the last year, a Sikh cab driver was brutally beaten by a man yelling ethnic and racial epithets, the ones Prabhjot Singh, Dr. Prabhjot Singh, heard 2 days ago: Osama, bin Laden, terrorist. In the last 2 weeks, in Chicago, a Sikh sitting in a restaurant was punched directly on his turban by an angry patron. Here in this city, in New York City, on Wall Street, a Sikh walking, just simply walking, like Dr. Prabhjot Singh, had his turban knocked off by someone. It did not happen in a vacuum. Now, 2 weeks ago, we released a report about school bullying here in the city. It's called One Step Forward and Half a Step Back. It's about the bullying of our children here in New York City and Asian American school children. What we found in our report, and this is fresh data, is that over 50% of the kids in our community suffer bias-based bullying. They're called bin Laden, they're called terrorists, they're called Taliban. Over 20% as a price of maintaining their Sikh identity suffer violence beyond bullying on the basis of their Sikh identity. So, my take-home message is that what happened is it did not happen as in a vacuum. And I'll conclude by saying this. There is a combination of poor public policy, crude media stereotypes, and little education in our schools that led to what happened to Dr. Prabhjot Singh and what's happening in the Sikh community. So take, for example, a flight I took last month to Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where a year and 1 month ago, 6 members of our community were shot and killed in a Sikh house of worship by a man with neo-Nazi ties. When I flew on that airplane, the first thing that happened before I got on the airplane was that I was pulled aside for secondary screening, and what was searched? My turban was searched. And that experience is replicated 100% of the time at some of the airports around the country. And so what's the take-home message? If the government is fearing the turban, maybe the public should fear the turban as well. Take, for instance, the situation with Sikhs in our U.S. military. Sikhs are presumptively not allowed to serve in our military with our turbans on. Now imagine, and we know that Sikhs have a long history of military service throughout the world that's decorated. Now imagine the perception if people saw a turban and beard and instead of seeing a terrorist, they saw a military hero. Take, for instance, that just this past Friday, I was in at Pearson Publishing in Boston, talking to a national textbook manufacturer about stereotypes about our community in school textbooks in this country. Do you know that if you read a textbook by Pearson or McGraw-Hill or Houghton Mifflin, the number one thing you tend to learn about Sikhs is that Sikhs 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, were associated with violence in India. And that's all you learn about the world's 5th largest religion, period. And so we have a problem. We're going to need textbook manufacturers and school teachers to teach our children the right messages. We're going to need our government to end discrimination at the airports, to end discrimination at the military. And if we do those things over time, it will take a long time. We'll get to an environment where someone will be safe. They can walk down the street like Dr. Prabhjot Singh was doing 2 days ago, not be called terrorist, not be called bin Laden, and just enjoy some time out in this great city. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your support today, and thank you to Columbia University for hosting this. First of all, I just want to mention that I'm really overwhelmed by the degree of support, hundreds of messages I've received over the last few days, and it really matters a lot, and I really appreciate it. Our family and community does. Very briefly, I'll mention what happened. I was walking with a friend after dropping off my 1-year-old and my wife at our apartment. I live and work in Harlem, and was passing a group of young men. The police are estimating around 15 or 20. It seemed like a large group. And I heard, "Get him, Osama." I heard "terrorist." And then I felt somebody grab my beard while on a bike, hit my chin. And what ensued was punching until I was ultimately on the ground. In terms of injuries, I'm very thankful that 3 bystanders intervened and stopped any further damage. My lower jaw is fractured and was wired yesterday by a oral surgeon. But as you can see, I'm here talking to you today, and very thankful for that it wasn't any worse. I'd also like to say, in terms of the actual event itself and its aftermath, I've been working with the NYPD Hate Crimes Unit, and they've been handling this as seems like a priority, and really appreciate their professionalism and support. What happens to the people that did this is in their hands, and I think it's worth for myself and at least my family to focus on other things. First, I just want to mention that I've lived in Harlem for 2.5 years, New York City for 10 years, lived in multiple places. My parents came from Indianapolis here today. And it's really not the Harlem that I've gotten to know in the last few years through our community work. and it's really not the face of our community. And when something like this happens, whether it's myself or to anybody else, I think it's critical to see that this is really not the community that we expect, certainly not the country that we expect. And yet, we still have these bias attacks, bias-related crimes. Last year, I wrote in the New York Times about tracking hate crimes almost as an academic. And this year, I feel very differently. Certainly after Saturday, I feel a deep amount of empathy for all the other people who've experienced things like this, whether or not it makes the news. Certainly for children that are bullied in schools and playgrounds, and certainly for the other woman, a Muslim who was attacked very shortly thereafter, which the NYPD is also looking into whether or not that's related. I sat next to her 2 beds down in the emergency department and got to know a little bit about her story, and feel badly, as one physician would for anybody that was in that position, and certainly as a fellow person. I'm speaking today, and why we brought this together, with 2 goals in mind. One is to get back to the work that I think is so important, to looking at what a healthier community actually means in a substantive way at the community level, as we've been working on with a number of institutions around the city, with the Harlem community, to really understand and work on what a healthier community looks like and means. That work's dearly important to me, and as soon as possible, I'd like to get back to it and plan on seeing patients tomorrow. The second reason is that I know there's a lot of interest in speaking to me and hearing about various angles on this, and I wanted to make sure that there was a consolidated focus for discussion, so that, you know, myself, my family, and the community can get back to doing the work, which I think is ultimately should be the focus of preventing events like this in the future. And finally, I just want to express an enormous degree of love and support for the attacks in Westgate in Nairobi. It's where my parents were born. It's where my family, where we grew up, and my extended family lives minutes away from Westgate. And some of my colleagues were there on Saturday, and it's just incredible to hear. And I want to just share from myself, certainly, just a deep degree of love and support for what's happening in Nairobi and Kenya now. Thank you.
Doctor, what do you think about the young teenagers who did this to you?
I think that it's absolutely critical that we go to their schools, we go to where they may congregate, we work with the community organizations, and we share and engage, ultimately. I want to live in a community where somebody feels comfortable asking me, hey, what's on your head? Why do you have that beard? You know, what are you doing here? Are you American? I think we should be able to ask those questions. And I want to make sure that I live in a community where young men like that, instead of having to scream out and act out on a Saturday night, can engage and have learned about it some other way. I have a young son, and he looks like an incredibly cute baby, and over the next many years, he'll increasingly look like a young sick man if he chooses that path. And ultimately, I want to make sure that he has the tools of engagement, and that he shares that with his friends in school, and that we have the support not only of a sick community, but for, you know, Americans, as teachers, as parents, that these sort of things are just not who we are. This is not an America that I recognize, and it's still not, even today.
Can you describe the initial moments of terror or fear, whatever it is that you're feeling at that time when you were attacked? What was going through your mind at that time?
I think the bottom line is that I wanted to move as far away from people that were moving forward. There was a group mobilizing behind me. I ran as fast as I could away. And I don't know what other people think about during these sort of events, but I wasn't thinking about very much.
So
Yep.
is it going to change anything about your routines in Harlem?
I'd say that if anything, it makes me ever more committed to our community and redoubling our efforts there. My area of work is community health and community health workers, creating opportunities for people while improving health in the long term. And I think that we actually need to broaden that discussion about mental health, how people fear, about psychology, about how people move around in the community. It's not a Harlem I know, and it's certainly not going to change how I move around the neighborhood.
Do you feel less safe in your neighborhood now?
I don't know yet. It's been 2 days. I'd say that I've always known that as a city-savvy person, there are certain places you should probably not head to, certain places that are fine. As a doctor, I end up seeing people in project housing. I end up seeing people in all parts of the city, and I will still go there. And I will still be received, I am sure, with the degree of welcome that I've experienced.
Would you be willing to forgive the treated with this?
Certainly. I think that the bottom line is when you're 14 or 15, you pick up messages from all across the community. I think what we need to do is make sure who gave these kids a green light to hate and understand that it was okay to act out in this way. And so they're young men, and they will certainly, with the NYPD's work and the district attorney's work, I'm sure be quite afraid themselves over the next few days about what's going to happen. And ultimately, what happens is a legal process, but from my perspective, I think that there's more higher priority work to do. Not higher priority than the NYPD's, but for me personally.
Yeah. Would you be able to identify any of the attackers, or were they familiar to you? Had you seen them around before?
I hadn't seen any of them before. Actually, I don't know. I couldn't identify them. It happened very quickly. It was dark, a lot of people moving, and I conveyed the best that I could to the police department. And unfortunately, for myself, and it seems like the witnesses, there isn't any sort of sketches that are possible.
Can you talk about the people who helped you out? Can you tell us who they are? And just talk about them in terms of, you talk a lot about community. Talk about them in terms of community as well. They're part of community as well.
Hugely so, and I really have an enormous degree of deep gratitude to those people who could have just walked by, as I know happens sometimes in New York City, but didn't. There was a nurse who lived across the street, recognized that I was also a physician and asked how I was and moved things quickly. There was an elderly African-American gentleman who, when he moved forward, told everybody to get lost and move and inquired to see how I was. And then there was another woman and another passerby that lived right across the street. For them, are they afraid of walking out of the street tomorrow morning? I don't know. But they were there, and it was important, and I really appreciate it.
Do you know their names? Do you know who they are?
I believe the NYPD knows their names. Their names are known, and I will, at some point, certainly convey my deep gratitude towards them personally.
Dr. Singh, you might talk about what you heard as they approached. You might talk about some details of the actual incident.
Sure, and only in brief. I work on some of these issues. My focus again is slightly different. There's a sensational aspect to this, and there's a painful aspect to this. I think it's important that it's clear what they are. Said, get him, somebody yelled Osama, and I heard terrorist. My beard was pulled first before my chin was hit. I had multiple people on bikes near me that were punching, and I was eventually down with punches to the jaw. After the initial, verbally mentioned things, it was just purely physical in movement, and it's still clear to me what happened. But any more detail than that, I'm sure I can leave it to your plentiful imaginations.
Doctor, do you feel it would have escalated if the people who came to help you didn't get there, or were they attacking you and then running
I think that the bystanders had the witnesses or the interveners had a critical role to play. I couldn't possibly and wouldn't guess what would have happened, but I certainly felt some degree of peace that I may be unconscious within seconds, and I wasn't. And I am sure that they had a role to play in that.
Are there any updates on the attackers?
Not that I know of. I think those are for the NYPD, those questions.
You said you did not like to get a good look at the assailants because it happened so fast. How do you think the police is responding to it? Is there any footage? Have you been able to get any description at all of who these assailants were?
There were multiple witnesses. The NYPD is trying to get as much information as they can. Even before I think they call it a hate crime, they have to make sure that everything fits with that. It certainly felt like it was motivated by my parents, but it would be leave all those questions to them. I don't know.
Dr. Singh, can you talk a little bit about the work that you do as a doctor and a teacher and in your community?
Sure. The major past of my work over the last 8 years has been moving all around the world to bring the best of low-income solutions, innovations back to America. I think that, we can cover people for health insurance, but we still don't necessarily know ways to really get to them, to reach them, and make them feel part of their communities. And so I've spent a lot of time bringing some of these innovations like community health workers to places like Harlem, where jobs and better health are absolutely part of the future of the community. And so that's the work I'll continue to do, and it's what I'd like to certainly stay focused on, and what I've received immense support to do from leadership all around, including community leaders.
If you could say anything to the young man who attacked you now, if you could say anything to them, what would it be?
My sense is that they would be under a bit of duress if I was talking to them at the moment. I think it's probably pretty pointless to ask what was going through their minds. Probably not anything worth really conveying. I think I would ask them if they had any questions, if they, knew what they were doing, if they, and maybe a bit of welcome. Invite them to the Gurdwara where we worship, get to know who we are, and then share it with their friends. These are tight social networks. Everybody knows everybody. And so, make sure that they have an opportunity to move past this as well.
So that might be it for questions. I want to make sure that everybody's questions are answered because there are a lot of people here, and Dr. Singh has already given a lot of one-on-one interviews, and so we're not going to be doing that today. If you have any questions, please ask them now. Just a couple of things that we want to make sure get communicated, and they've already been said, but they're worth repeating, that the Sikh faith is an independent religion. It's separate from other religions, and it originated in and around modern-day India about 500 years ago. Obviously, Amardeep Singh of the Sikh Coalition has a lot of answers about bullying and kids and schools and what can be done there to improve education. This is important in this case because a lot of the perpetrators appear to be very young. Also, just with respect to SALDEF's work in conjunction with Stanford University, some of the high-level findings are that 70% of Americans see a person in a turban and have no idea who they are, what they're about, tend to identify turbans and beards with Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Shintos, and not necessarily Sikhs, even though 99% of the people in this country, the vast majority of people in turbans, are Sikh Americans. So this is an important thing for all of you to know because you can take this information away. You guys are reporters and you're disseminating information, so it really helps to have you in the know and aware of the facts about the Sikh religion. So if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them now. Yeah.
Do you think there's something that Sikhs in India can do as well to spread this message? Our own Prime Minister is a practicing Sikh, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who wears a turban, and he's a Prime Minister of India. And this is something, the message of which could possibly be carried forward in a more definite fashion.
it would be hard to even begin to comment upon India's own situation and own history of just incredible ethnic violence and minority communities that are targeted constantly, repeatedly.
Yeah.
Massacres in Gujarat, and certainly all over the country. I'd say that it certainly applies to Sikhs in India, that they should also continue to play a proactive role, and they clearly are if the Prime Minister is a Sikh man. But I think ultimately we stand in solidarity. Community here in America may be more tied to America, and that's the case here. I don't know India very well, but I know America pretty well. And so, you know, it'd be great to have a dialogue further, but for now, I probably best not to give advice to what they should do.
Can you just be specific of what street you were walking in which direction? We know it was 110th and Lennox, but exactly where?
It's walking west on 110th and Lennox. At the
West on 110th?
I was walking west on 110th and Lennox. That's at the site of the incident.
Taking out from your opinion piece NYT last year, do you think it's because the government, the FBI, doesn't really classify hate crimes against Sikhs in, you know, as a classification? It probably, you know, makes incidents like these even more in
A lot's changed since I wrote that piece a year ago. The FBI is formally including and disaggregating their hate crime statistics to include not only Sikhs, but other minority communities that need greater focus now. There's one question of tracking and surveillance. It's completely another question for real solutions at the community level. And that's not something that we can leave just to government. It's important that policies are in the right direction, but just as I've seen in my work as a policy professor, the work is in the application of the community level. And so we have a lot of work to do with a lot of different people, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Can I just say something on the issue of what Dr. Singh would say to his attackers and his response, which I found very poignant but not surprising. There's with the Sikh Coalition, the hate crime victims we've worked with here in New York City, we've consistently found that Sikh hate crime victims here in the city, rather than wanting the system to engage in punitive measures to go after the attackers, are more inclined, as it seems Dr. Singh is more inclined, to work towards education and uplifting the person who committed the act to make them a better human being. This is consistent with deeply held beliefs in Sikhism in terms of forgiveness and the like. And, you know, Brooke had pointed out the point about educating people on our faith and our distinct beliefs. This is a distinct belief that I think plays an important role in Dr. Singh's reaction to how he would react to the attackers if he met them now.
And you did say you would invite them to your house of worship as well. Where is that, sir?
We have multiple in the area, some in Queens, and we have one in Manhattan, which we've just been getting together. We're a small 30-something community, 30-something-year-old community that's trying to get together space to actually worship regularly in the city. And so that's a bit downtown. And whenever we have something that's a bit more stable, we'd love to have them there. And certainly in Queens and all over New Jersey, there are other opportunities.
Doctor, what injuries did you talked about your jaw. What other injuries did you suffer?
The primary injuries were to my lower jaw, and then just bruising on my torso, and then a relatively small puncture wound in my elbow. I think as a physician, it seems like as a breed we minimize, and you know, I think the fact that I can talk to you today certainly conveys a sense that I'm doing okay, and I really, again, appreciate all the questions about my personal injuries.
Doctor, I wanted to ask you, you're saying that there are questions that you would have been happy to answer regarding your beard, your turban. What are some of the stereotypes or something to clear the air that you can tell us right now that you would like to convey about the turban and your beard?
I'll tell you a stereotype that I'd love to see emerge over the next 20 years, when hopefully my son is 20 years old. My father used to always tell me in Nairobi in Kenya, whenever you saw a man in a turban and a beard, a sardar as they're called, you knew you could just call for help. You could ask them to do anything. You could ask them to move groceries for you, or if there was an attacker on the street, or anything. I hope that in hopefully not 20 years, but over the next few decades or few years, we can move to a point where you see a person in a turban and a beard and the exact opposite reaction emerges of fear, and recognize that that turban and beard sitting next to you on a plane may be your first line of defense, and the first person to jump into a line of trouble for you, as we have done in the military across the world, here in the United States, and just on a regular person-to-person level in our communities. I think that's a core teaching. You see this face and look for help. That's what we're here to do.
One more. Can I just ask, as your students and as your colleagues, what would you suggest that we can do to support your community and to spread awareness? We are looking to help, and we would just like a bit of guidance as to how we can do that.
First of all, just a great amount of gratitude for the students that did come today. And I know that many others tried to. I think that your work that you do as people that are working in low-income areas across the country and world is the primary work that needs to be done. It fundamentally is about engagement. It's fundamentally about breaking down barriers between things that cause violence. And I'd say keep on doing your good work, and you'll certainly see all the opportunities as they come up. And it's not just about SIX, it's really about a broader question about where are we going as a people. You've heard me say this in our classes. And that's the message. Continue doing what you're doing and make sure you stay true to who you are in the process.
Thanks again so much for coming. Here's what we're going to do, you guys, just to give Dr. Singh a clear path out. If you could just clear the way over here, please, and he can walk out. You can get some pictures of him on the way out, as long as you guys stay low in front so that the cameras in back can get some pictures of him walking out. But then Amardeep Singh here and Jagdeep Singh will be available for questions afterwards. Can you guys please get down so that the cameras in the back have a shot of Dr. Singh as he exits the room.
Good luck. Thanks, man.
Down. Come on, guys. Down in front, please.
Okay, we'll be here for a few minutes. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us here today. My name is Brooke Salkoff. I'm here with SALDEC, which is the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund out of Washington, D.C. And the Sikh Coalition, New York-based Sikh Coalition, is also here hosting this event. We'd like to, first of all, thank Columbia University. Columbia University's SEVA group, the student group that has been so helpful in reacting and supporting and facilitating this event for us today. Also the School of International and Public
Justice, service, compassion, and in remembrance of one God. I think many of these are universal ideals shared not only by most Americans, but most humans. Now, at the same time, although we know that this is what our faith stands for, we learned through this research that, in fact, our articles of faith, in particular the turban and beard oftentimes, is causing quite a bit of confusion. It's, in fact, one of the big takeaways from the research was that the number one figure that's associated with the turban and beard amongst the average American is that of Osama bin Laden. Think of that for a moment. The face of violence and extremism, terrorism over the last couple decades is the face of our faith, which at its core, and as I said, is built upon compassion, loyalty, truth and justice. So if you'd like any additional information.
Program Director for the Sikh Coalition, and Dr. Prabhjot Singh will speak after that. But each of them will take 3 to 5 minutes to talk about the latest research, and then we'll open it up to questions, and I'll be back.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you, members of the press, members of our community who are here. My name is Jasjit Singh. I'll spell it for you, Jasjit. Last name Singh, Singh. You should just keep that last name handy today. And I'm the Executive Director of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, SALDEF. So thank you all for being here with us today. It's obviously on an unfortunate circumstance that we're all meeting here today, but it's also out of, I believe, concern for our community as New Yorkers and as Americans. We have with us, of course, Prabhjot Singh, who's going to share his experience, but what I'd like to share...
And the Earth Institute. We'd like to thank Jesse and Steve Cohen of the Earth Institute for helping to facilitate this event on such really short notice. So as I mentioned, the event today, this news conference, is hosted by 2 Sikh advocacy organizations who are working in partnership, SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Sikh Coalition based here in New York City. Coincidentally, there are 2 very timely research reports out of each organization that shows that what has happened to Dr. Prabhjot Singh on Saturday night is not an isolated incident, it's not an isolated act, unfortunately. So here's how things are going to work today. I'm here really to facilitate and make sure that you all get what you need in terms of information and sound and pictures. But we realize that everybody is on deadline, and we're going to try to keep it as tight as we can. So you'll only hear from 3 people today. Executive Director Jasjit Singh, who's on your right here. Also, Amardeep Singh, who is the program
with you today from the perspective of our national advocacy group is that, unfortunately, the sort of assault that Prabhjot Singh has faced is not something that we are terribly unfamiliar with. In the years after 9/11, our community has been, unfortunately, disproportionately targeted, whether it comes from challenges related to hate crimes, racial profiling, school bullying, or employment discrimination. This community is no stranger to these types of incidents. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we released some research results in collaboration with Stanford University, a report called Turban Myths, where we started to unwrap exactly how big the challenge of misunderstandings and misconceptions are as they relate to Sikh Americans. Now, we are the world's 5th largest religion. There are about 500,000 Sikhs in this country. Our beliefs are around truth,